To start us off today with our first panel, we've got a panel discussion titled Our Land, Our Stories, Voices from the Edges, which will highlight community perspectives on conservation, justice, and belonging. Our facilitator is Nessie Reid, who some of you may have seen yesterday on on another one of our panels. She's the director of the Global Diversity Foundation. She lives and farms in Wales and works internationally on agroecology, food sovereignty, and land connection. She's joined by Rosebell Abwonji, the founder of Jazeera Sustainable Futures in Kenya, a movement pioneering community-led conservation. Francesca Masoero, an Italian cultural organizer and researcher with the Global Environments Network, working to bridge cultural practice and environmental action. And Maritza Arizaga, a Mexican-American equity strategist focused on community resilience and justice-driven conservation. Together, they'll share stories from the front lines of environmental and social change. So with that, I'll hand over to Nessie, and let's give them all a warm welcome.
Thank you for that. Can everyone hear me at the back? Great. Well, that just made my job easier. I now don't have to introduce you all. Good morning, everyone. How is everybody? How is everybody? Great. Well done to all of us for dragging ourselves out of bed on a Sunday morning. But what a wonderful place to be. What an incredible place St. Ethelburga's. I'm incredibly grateful. I first joined St. Ethelburga's about 10 years ago as a spiritual ecology fellow here, before I'd moved to West Wales and fallen in love with a Welsh farmer, and the past 10 years has been, a long journey of really investigating what do we mean by spiritual ecology, what do we mean by deep ecology, and I always think there's a useful term, it's called the grandmother test. If you can explain to your grandmother what you do or what something is, then you've succeeded. I haven't succeeded in that. And I think half of my family are like, what exactly do you do? But that's okay. And I think sometimes things are explainable and sometimes they're not. But in light of that, I think if we're going to be talking about spiritual ecology, we also need to be talking about conservation. And in that, who is allowed to be conservationists and who is not? Who is allowed to have a seat at the table in what is often a very beautiful, virtuous, and also problematic space when we talk about conservation. I'm talking specifically about wildlife and biodiversity conservation. And so today our session is called Our Land, Our Stories, Decolonising Conservation. And we've debated that term a lot now between us over the past few months, and do we want to use that term? Do we not? What does it mean? Is it probably, there's so many layers just in that word. And in it can be a word in this theme where we bristle, we hear something and there can be, well, I'm not part of that. And so as we unpick and explore and examine and dissect it together, I guess I'd invite all of us, to be in that space of open inquiry and, very much how do we critique the idea and not the person. So I just want to kind of set that tone. Now, we've got about 50 minutes, which is just the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully today we're going to be seeding some ideas, some inquiries that Fran and myself and Simran, my colleague at the back, we're from Global Diversity Foundation. So we are an organisation that's about 25 years old, and we specifically support change makers all around the world working on issues around social justice, environmental justice. We work in spiritual ecology, so the intersection of agroecology, spirituality, but also very practically activism. So a lot of our work is in how do we support and resource activists and change makers all around the world. So if you'd like to find out more, please come and talk to us at some point. And then I'm really blessed that we have dear friends Rosebell and Maritza joining us today. And I mean, Rosebell and I met back in Morocco last year in May, because Rosebell is a fellow, is now a Global Diversity Foundation trustee. We're very lucky. And also a Conservation and Communities Fellow. So Rosebell is one of 30 people, leaders working in the conservation and biodiversity field. And I was lucky enough to go to Cambridge in November because Rosebell is a master's student on the Conservation Leadership Masters, where I also met Maritza. And it's just been a joy to meet you as well, Maritza, and hear about your work around belonging and conservation and that kind of messy area between the two, and your work spanning Colorado, Mexico, and so much more. So, when I say the word, so today, really one of the questions we're going to be looking at is the fundamental premise of conservation, despite good intentions. I suppose our leading question is, has conservation inadvertently created a gap between humans and nature? If some of you may be familiar with the work of E.O. Wilson, so the half-Earth debate, also known as the pristine nature or fortress conservation, in essence, a beautiful idea. You know, we love orangutans, we love rhinos. You know, if you don't like great chimps, then frankly, I don't want anything to do with you. You know, who doesn't like a chimp? I mean, we all do, right? No one wants to see, unless you're a psychopath, no one wants to see a rhino dehorned. But actually, the problematic nature of when we have conservation, when we have people taken out of natural environments, what then happens, the repercussions, is tenfold, is 1,000-fold. For example, in areas where local communities, indigenous communities have been pushed out of their ancestral lands, the level of poaching in that area increases. Why? Because people who were living subsistently, people who were living on that land, with the land, suddenly they have no livelihood. Suddenly they can't even buy their child, you know, basic medicine for a preventable disease, you know, even things like diarrhea, something that could be incredibly treated. And then you get £80 to dehorn a rhino, for example. So we know that the biodiversity in areas that are protected by local communities and indigenous peoples is higher. That is, you can look at IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. The evidence is out there. So today we're going to be dissecting that question, looking at what does reconciliation, restitution, and reparations mean, particularly in the context of the US. We're going to hear from Rosebell about Kenya and from Francesca around our work around conservation justice and our Conservation and Communities Fellowship, and our ongoing inquiry into our own pedagogy at GDF of how we work. We have a program in the High Atlas in Morocco called the High Atlas Cultural Landscapes Program. And we've been really dissecting that. What does that mean to work in an area, and to make sure that we are not helicoptering in as an organization. So, I've probably missed lots in my intro, and I've probably said too much already. Maritza, who are you? What do you think? Tell us a bit about the history of the US and protected areas and your view on conservation and the separation of nature.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great, thanks. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. So my theme for this conversation is really cemented on the idea of unlearning. So I began my career in conservation at Colorado State University, which is considered a land-grant university in the entire nation of in the United States, which essentially means that the federal government granted states land, federal land, public land, for endowments to develop agricultural schools or mechanical schools, in this case for primarily white folks in the 1900s to acquire an education. This land was acquired, oftentimes coerced by tribal or treaties that were not honored by tribal nations. And so that was the foundation of this institution, right? I think it was important to bring it up because it granted me an education, but it also did at a high cost of not honoring sovereignty, of really significantly impacting the sort of scarring of the land and what it meant to be in connection to nature. So the work that I was doing after I received my undergraduate in ecosystem science and sustainability, I worked in conservation. I was really interested in protected areas and national parks. I supported the sort of essentially the capacity building and opportunities for individuals to come and learn about our national park system, because it is quite beautiful. If any of you have the chance to visit many of our national parks, they are quite splendid. The first one being, of course, Yellowstone, and probably the most iconic, which was established in 1872. And it was, I'll sort of give you an exact quote as to why this particular area was protected, as it sort of became the foundation of the national park system and protected areas around the world. And it really was intended to be a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of people, a place under exclusive control of the Secretary of the Interior. So this in itself, if you think about those words, it became from this notion of disruption of what land is to the utilitarianism of land, to use it to someone's pleasure, right? So even this foundation of a national park in itself, while we wanted to retain the beauty of it, came at this altering of this relationship with nature, and at the displacement of communities that called that place home, that saw themselves as a part of that nature, rather than something to own or possess, sort of the relationship within. And so Colorado is centered in the U.S., right in the middle of the country, and so this is what caused the westward expansion, and was really at the core of all the displacement of indigenous peoples, of the Native American communities that were there, of the Homestead Act, which granted sort of access to land to citizens of the United States to continue to expand westward. So this history is really, really core to how I worked and operated, right? This is a lot for me. At that time, I was really keen on thinking about how do we continue to protect these lands for future generations, but I was just thinking ahead, and I think, and when we talk about the land and the ruptures that existed and the conservation aspect, it's important to also think about the past and how this land is continuing to heal. So I'm going to pause there to give you a little bit more about how the impact of protected areas also transcended borders and went to Kenya, in this case.
Right. Thank you. So picking up on Maritza's story, I'll share a bit about myself. I like to say that I became a conservationist quite by accident. My background is in business, and conservation was not something that I ever thought that I would be. I grew up in the city, and my dreams for myself was wearing heels and a nice dress and going to the office and becoming a big boss lady. I really had no intention of getting into conservation until by circumstance a job came across, and one of my friends pestered me to apply for this role, and I found myself getting a job in conservation with a community-based organization and moving to a far end of the country, living and working with a beautiful community that I'd never really interacted with. And over the years, I got to really relate and understand this community and what conservation really meant for them and what nature and environment meant for them. So to begin with, historically, many years ago, we had settlers coming into Kenya. Yes, it's Kenya. So we had settlers coming into Kenya, and the community, it's the Maasai community that I was working with, and the Maasai community traditionally are pastoralists, so they move around a lot, and their relationship with the environment at that time was one of an extension of self, right? They looked at land as something that gave them water, that gave them grass, that gave them food and nutrition to be able to sustain themselves, to be able to sustain their livestock. So they would move from place to place. Once they were done feeding their livestock the grassland, they'd be able to move to another place to give that space of land time to rest and heal, and then they would come back to it in another season. And they would share these resources with other communities, neighboring communities around them, because they knew that this was not something that was inherently for themselves, but something that was to be shared with people. So when the white settlers came into that space, that dynamic completely changed. All of a sudden they came in and they saw that, there's this community and they've left all this land idle and they're not using it. What's happening here, right? And they said, okay, these people don't know what to do with this land, so we are going to take over it and let's start farming, because this is very productive land, this is very fertile land, so let's use it for agriculture. And so this community suddenly found that, okay, they've been moved out of this space that was once theirs, and they've been told, this is no longer your land, you need to move into another place, which was very confusing for them. But that started the shift with their relationship with land, because land stopped being something that was an extension of self, started becoming a commodity, started becoming something that could be taken and owned by people. And that came into the creation of the national parks, right? Because then tourism became something that was becoming very prominent. Hunting was something that was being practiced widely, and they felt that this community was going to be a threat to the wildlife. So they pushed them further away, and they said, we are going to create these pristine places where we're going to protect these animals, we're going to protect this wildlife because you're a threat to them, which is not true, because these communities had been living with this wildlife for so many years, and I got to experience and see that firsthand when I lived with them. They would explain to me how to know when the hyena is walking, how to know the seasons of the elephants, where they are moving, what they are looking for. Lions, they were never really afraid of any animals that they interacted with, and they would tell me that if you're killed by a wild animal, it's probably because you have an evil spirit. So they really didn't believe that animals intentionally are things that will come and attack you. They would always say that animals will avoid you at all costs because they know that you're a human being and they really do not want your paths to cross. So by the time they come after you, you probably hold an evil spirit. So for me, this narrative did not sit as people who are out to attack nature. They're not people who are not understanding what the utilization of land is. The narrative that had been painted for many generations was a false narrative. It's a narrative that stole from this community and kept them away from the land and ultimately changed their relationship with nature, because unfortunately, as we move on and as we progress, their relationship with the land has become more commercial. They've stopped looking at land as something that feeds them, as something to be taken care of. It's become that land can be taken away from you, so fence it, protect it, keep other people out. And that has ultimately shifted how they protect nature and how we protect nature. And that's something that hopefully we'll get to talk about further as we go along in this talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me fine? Great. So yeah, to introduce a little bit myself, well, I come here with a hat of a colleague of Nessie and Simran at Global Diversity Foundation, but maybe I'll just open a brief parenthesis to say and also honor the learning and unlearning journey that I've been going through, especially in the last 10 years, because I've been working also as a curator and community organizer in Morocco, especially Marrakesh, close to where GDF works for the, as I said, for the past 10 years. So building a connection between artistic practices and especially community-based and socially engaged art practices with questions of especially belonging. In a context, a urban context like Marrakesh that has been profoundly fractured and fragmented for people in relationship to their connection to the land, the connection to their collective memories and heritage, both tangible and intangible. And I think something that has really driven me over the years is this question, and here I quote a brilliant artist, Dutch artist, Jeanne van Eswijk, when she asks, how can we belong to a territory when territories are fractured? And how can we build a collective understanding of a territory when you don't see even a collective yet? So I think a lot of my work has been really trying to be a vessel in supporting the creation of collective meaning and collective visions. And I'm saying this because a lot of what we do at GDF, I think, is very much, goes very much along the same lines. We've been having a retreat lately, and rethinking, what's the mission and how do we all see the organization itself, and the metaphor of the vessel, the channel, the rhizome was very much present in our collective imagining of what GDF does, both very contextually and locally in the context of the High Atlas in Morocco, but also globally or internationally. or across different worlds, let's say. And so just to give a bit of a contextualization of one of the core programs that I'm also part of, that Nessie mentioned before, the Conservation Justice Program, really emerged, first of all, out of the, from a history, 25 years old history of working with conservation leaders, especially in the global south or in the global majority world, and with the understanding that also many other organizations, NGOs and scholars have pointed out to, that conservation is primarily led by communities on the ground, and yet those that hold the ties to both money and the power of shaping what conservation looks like today is somewhere else, is, let's call it global north, the global minority. That's not really the point. So the question is, first of all, how to very pragmatically support leaders like Rosebell and others to access funds, for instance. So the Conservation Justice Program has one very somewhat practical, maybe not that sexy program, the Conservation and Communities Fellowship, that really offers a set of trainings into fundraising, into leadership, into public speaking for conservation leaders to be able to access donors and also position themselves in relationship also to the power, the gatekeeping power that Global North NGOs often have in reshaping what a conservation project looks like. And there is very interesting work that has been done by Maliasili, which is also a Kenyan organization that has been doing a lot of reports that offer a lot of facts on what is needed for the field of conservation to shift and rethink itself, maybe decolonize itself. Another portion of the Conservation Justice Program is maybe more critical and self-critical, and it's really trying to, we've called it the Conservation Future Dialogues, and it's really trying to sort of sit with the trouble of what conservation looks like today and think and try to collectively think how can we reimagine it radically differently? How can we sit together across people within this field and have the difficult conversations about what is the history, the very problematic history to an extent of conservation. As Maritza was just saying, a lot of settled colonies have used the creation of national parks, not only in the US, we can mention Israel, for instance, to impede the access to land for local and indigenous communities. So how can we radically reimagine our relationship to one another and to land within or beyond conservation itself?
Thank you, Fran. Just to dig in a bit into the Maliasili report, which if you haven't read, yeah, we highly recommend. As Fran mentioned, our fellowship is built on it. It's called Greening the Grassroots, and it's an open source report from Maliasili, a wonderful peer of ours. And in it, they have concluded, so they interviewed 50 organizations across Africa, 50 community-based organizations, and only 5% of global philanthropic money, 5% that is destined for Africa, goes to African-led NGOs. So the other 95%, which is for the continent of Africa, goes through what we call bingos, the big NGOs. Now, we're a very small grassroots NGO, so we don't want to be like, we don't like the bingos, but it's just interesting that point of where does the power lie, where does the decision making lie. And it always makes me think of an example that a friend shared years ago, who works in the kind of field of water and sanitation and community-based water programs, and they were working in Gujarat in India. And this very well-meaning, Western NGO had gone in and said, right, you need water wells. you need wells here, 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 here. And so they put these water wells in without properly consulting the communities, right? And the women were like, you've ruined our social structure. Like, we love walking together, we get a break from our, from our husbands, we get a break from the housework, we stop, we chat, we walk, for 2 hours, but like, it's fun, and then they bring the water back. And that's just a really simple but good example of very well-meaning initiatives, but often if it's not rooted in conservation, it's like if someone came and told me how I should run my farm, I'd be like, you don't know the land, you don't know the soil structure, you don't know the aspect, you don't know which parts are wet. Like, the idea of that is diabolical, and yet some of the top-down conservation initiatives are based on that, which I think is really fascinating. So I just would like to dig in a bit more into this term we've started to use a lot at GDF, and we've already mentioned, is this process of unlearning, of unschooling. And I'd love to hear from each of you how your unlearning process has been over the years. There's a wonderful podcast I listened to recently, and the conservationist in it, she said, I'm a recovering conservationist, and I just want to say as well, we're not damning the conservation world, but it's just looking at how do we sort of tweak it to a point where it's truly led by community, not just in consultation and in consent, but actually truly being community sovereign-led. Yeah, so Maritza, how has your unlearning process been?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll say that what led for my career to be in conservation started off as sort of almost a lost soul in a way. I'm an immigrant in the U.S. I came to the U.S. when I was 6. I'm originally from Mexico, and my family is very much so culturally connected to those roots. And so for us, the way to connect to nature was to be outdoors, to learn from my father was a farmer as well. So for us to connect to those roots, to see the species that were migrating from Mexico to the U.S. and understanding like the species that he actually recognized as well. So there was so much of that being grounded in place that inspired me to even think about a career in conservation, right? And so when for me, I was an immigrant child, so it was either lawyer, doctor, or engineer. Those are the options, right? And so obviously there's a lot of struggle there and limitations on what you can and cannot do in education. And so I couldn't pursue a doctor career, and so I switched majors halfway, sort of bold. To your point, Nessie, my parents still don't really know what I do. They're just like something with the environment, maybe. And so that is, I think, was sort of the inspiration of that transition for me, and then really falling in love with what conservation was, right, without knowing the history of the land where I was in. And then, I started working in conservation organizations, and I had the privilege of going to the Pacific Northwest and doing conservation work with communities there. That were doing a social innovation lab, which essentially is a jargony word to say bringing communities together to decide how to better connect and create transboundary opportunities for conservation, for sustainable livelihoods, for indigenous leadership, and really creating connectivity and a network between the, Washington, British Columbia, and Southeast Alaska. And in these conversations, I was so honored to be invited and to sometimes be in ceremony with partners and people and elders that wanted to welcome me. But that it also, I realized in those conversations, sitting in circle and hearing about their history and how they're thinking about reparations, that I didn't really understand the history of Colorado. I didn't understand the dynamics that existed. We would talk about settler colonialism, and we talked about how protected areas were formed, but I didn't really understand what happened, why there was so much displacement in Colorado. And so that was, to me, what rooted me to go back, to do local work, to work with community, to learn about the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Southern Ute that call that land home, and some of them don't have ancestral ties, but don't have treaties that are recognized, right? So think about the co-management and the stewardship and the legal sovereignties and the treaties that were violated, and so that to me was what I wanted to unlearn and and relearn really, is understand that history. And through that, it was, it was also could have been really easy for me to lean on my Indigenous peers and be like, tell me, teach me, right? But what kind of burden would I do, to have them relive that trauma, to leave the stories of boarding schools, right? That sometimes we as conservationists or just practitioners in general want that easy solution. We want to have that answer, like, well, tell me what happened, but I think that is also limiting, and in a certain way, it puts the burden and the hard work on someone else that has already done and has gone through so much trauma. So it was on me to do that learning, to learn about boarding schools, to go and attend and do the reading, all of this stuff, and the traumatic that it was. And for me, as as an immigrant, also that triggered something in me, right? Like not knowing where I belonged, and the fearing that sense of displacement was very, very much there, and trying to navigate. The place that I called home, where sometimes, I couldn't call home, that I wasn't allowed to call it home. That felt hard, right? And so, and there's always something in there that was quite cathartic for me. And so I think that to me, that's been still a journey and a continued learning experience. Yeah, I think I'll pause there. But this is just kind of tying a little bit more into whose responsibility is it to learn the full history, and what responsibility do I carry forward in that sense of wanting to create transformative practices, of leaning in and learning and having others lead and us to learn and step back. So I'll offer this one last thing. And so for in working in this local community work now that I was doing, my work was really centered around transformative justice and working with community partners of not only justice for my community, which was immigrant communities in Colorado and in sort of in the Western US, but also distinguishing between stakeholders and rights holders, right? So we want to think about partnership, and we want to create transformative practices that are equitable for environmental justice rights. We want good quality, we want good air quality, we want good water quality, we want access to land, and also there are rights that individuals were violated and don't have. So navigating those two dynamics of how do we create equitable practices and transformative justice practices while also reconciling and creating reparation practices for individuals that were displaced.
Maritza, on that note, I wonder, while we're here, if you can talk a bit about reconciliation, restitution, and reparations. What do they mean to you? I'm aware, for some folks, myself included, I'm not entirely sure what we really mean by that. And I wonder, from your experience, what do those terms actually mean? What do they mean for you, and what do they mean in actual practice as well?
Yeah. So one example that has happened in the last few years is there was a coalition of Arapaho and Cheyenne colleagues and indigenous leaders that got together in Colorado and were trying to do something quite simple, but it felt momentous and huge, right? They were trying to rename a mountain. So Mount Evans is a mountain in Colorado, and Evans was he was essentially a leader in creating a devastating massacre in Colorado. And so it was something that was just so traumatic, and you could always hear it, Mount Evans, the communities that live there, that don't live there, but have ancestral ties, were always constantly reminded of this just travesty. And so the coalition got together and wanted to rename it Mount Blue Sky. And so everyone got together. There was a lot of advocacy campaigns that were done and coalition campaigns, and they were successfully able to rename it Mount Blue Sky. I think it was last year or the year before, maybe 2 years ago. So now it's honoring the people that call themselves the Blue Sky people, which is the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, and they're able to, even in small ways, create that reparation and path towards reconciliation. In my own practice, I'm still trying to navigate what it means to rematriate, right? Like land back. We hear this is a big topic that happens in the U.S. is land back. What does land back mean? It can mean the repossession of land by some communities in terms of honoring the treaties that were broken. But it also means a reconnection to the land, a reconnection to the cultural ties, the historical ties. So working with whether it's our local Colorado Parks and Wildlife or conservation institutions and organizations to create better co-management and co-stewardship with tribal communities is a step forward in that direction, right? To have them be sort of the leaders in sense of how the planning process works for the creation of new state parks, if we're going to expand it, or it means, you know, working in partnership with in a municipal level, giving individuals that have ancestral ties to the land an opportunity for them to practice their cultural rituals and learn about the history of Colorado. So those are the kind of the stepping stones. And this is still a process, but I think those are some of the ways in which we are thinking about reconciliation and reparations.
Thank you. For me, the process of unlearning really began when I started working with the community. When I first got the job in the Maasai Mara, a lot of people would come to me with, you know, rumors and cautions that tell me, oh, you know, you need to be careful because these people behave in this certain kind of way and they do this and you need to watch your back, and if they act up, you know, you should be ready to leave at any point in time. And all these stories really begin to feed into your head and you come in with a lot of caution. And as I stayed with them, I began to understand that a lot of these narratives are narratives that have been carried over the years, these false narratives that this community are people who don't know how to relate to land, which are completely false. And as I started to work with them, I had to really let go of a lot of the things that I was holding on to, which included some of my dreams of being the city urban girl with heels and walking around. You had to embrace the flats, and you had to embrace different kinds of clothing. They are pastoralists. I really had to learn how to eat meat. I was not a big meat eater. I had to learn the taste of meat. I had to learn how to talk about the weather. I started understanding grass. I used to talk about cows. So I just created this whole new language and started to understand them from that sense, opening up my doors to the community members and really just welcoming them over a cup of tea and talking about their children, talking about their dreams and their aspirations. And then you really begin to sink into who they are and what they value and how they go about things. So I learned that trust is something that is built and cultivated over a period of time. But then as I continued to stay with them, and even as I sit here, I reflect on my positionality and the privilege that I have to sit here and talk about them when they should be in this room speaking for themselves, because this is their story and they would tell it in such a beautiful, honest way that I can never do. And there's so many things that I experienced and shared with them that I can never really relate in this room, because that's their story and they're the ones who get to tell it. So in learning to really look at it from that point of view, and my commitment in conservation has become more about looking at creating spaces and opening doors for these people to come into rooms like this, into spaces like Cambridge, into spaces like working with GDF, to be able to speak for themselves. And that's what attracted me to the fellowship with GDF, because there you get to work with other grassroots organizations and other people from around the world, and understanding the work that they're doing is what brought me to Cambridge, because then I get to meet people like Maritza and the amazing work that she's doing, and then you really begin to relate with people from around the world and find ways to open the doors and to allow these people to come in. Yeah, I think that's what I'll say for now. Yeah.
So in sharing a bit about my unlearning and maybe also our unlearning journey, maybe I'll start by sharing a quote from, we just hosted online a fantastic panel conversation that you can find on the YouTube channel of Global Diversity Foundation, which was entitled Sites of Experimentation, that brought together 3 amazing women leaders in conservation, spirituality, artists and revolutionaries. And one of them, Ameyali Ramos, I remember she started introducing herself. She's also Mexican from Chiapas, and sharing that she grew up in a world in which many worlds fit. And I was thinking, I actually didn't grow up in a world in which many worlds fit. I grew up in Italy and with a very narrow version of the world, actually. And I think in my personal journey, arriving at 20-something in Morocco has been the beginning of an incredible unlearning process, which is ongoing, and an understanding, which I think is very much part of also what the work that GDF does, that what we need is not only a shift in power dynamics, but a dramatic shift in perspectives, an epistemological, ontological shift. And in that sense, what I value personally a lot in GDF is very much that at the root at the core of the organization from the beginning is this sitting with the complexities of this world, embracing an holistic perspective, bringing together people that go from agroecology to agronomy to arts to anthropology and to statistics, and try to be all together in that room and do something meaningful for and with communities and the leaders of those communities across the world. I think one core aspect that is so important in all the work that we all do is the question of time. You were talking about trust, building trust with other people, whether it's colleagues or communities, takes a lot of time and listening, and a capacity being enabled and taking the risk of deep listening, and listening also sometimes to things that are hard to listen and incorporate and be open to be completely shifted by how other people and realities see and exist in the world, and to connect it back to the facts on the ground is that, and this was also again another very important finding in, for instance, the Magliasili report, is that the whole funding structure for conservation work doesn't give people time to, doesn't give somebody like Rosebell to have the time to build the trust with the community she wants to work with, because the greatest majority of funding is a year-long at best, project-based. How can you come in and build a meaningful relationship with a place and a community, if this is the way in which it works. So I think what we are trying to do with GDF is, I mean, among other things, also starting to become ourselves small funders with small seed grants, and trying to really shift and rethink on the one hand, how to influence from a position of power compared to others, you know, still, even though, you know, very small scale, but still Global North NGO, how to influence to an extent a shifting in perspective into donors, and also in relationship to the program in Morocco, how to keep questioning and re-questioning what we're doing and how we're doing it, and being in conversation with the communities we're supporting. It is a program that was started because one of the founder of GDF was based and had a very deep relationship with the place in which the High Atlas program started. So I feel that it has been, you know, it's not something new that GDF has also has in its DNA, this, you know, taking the time to listen to needs on the ground, conditions on the ground, to then develop and respond with a proposal or a program. But maybe some...
Yeah, just going to for a moment not be the interviewer and just share, because I'm so glad you said that, Fran, about time. It's like time and trust, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. And, you know, as you mentioned, most funders want to give 2-year grants, and most funders want to grant projects. So you're stuck in this poverty trap the civil society, NGO, non-profit sector, I think, is stuck in a poverty trap and a trap. Yeah, it's starvation, and it's like a kind of scarcity. And so you start to build trust, you start to build communities, and we talk a lot about spiritual ecology, seasons, and yet it's like, okay, but actually there is this deadline and we've got to come good. And I think there is a shift, which I think is brilliant. I don't think the shift is fast enough, because there's this, we might give you a 2-year grant, 3 years if you're lucky, to build a relationship. Should we just stay there for a bit longer? You know, to a relationship, you get married. Anybody who's married in the room, it takes, you know, the first few years you date and it's great, and then it's after the 3-4 years you really see if someone's good at doing the recycling and the washing up, and then you start to get annoyed because they put the things, you know, like things take time, relationships take time. You know, when we really think about seasons, I find in my own way of, you know, running GDF, I really am trying to unlearn this thing around time and seasonality. You know, as a team, we all need time to be fallow. We need time to just be like, you know, I'm having a bad month. We need to have those wintering times. We need those times of resting, of stopping. It's my dream, it's our intention. I really would love to have a month where we can just actually really compost, where we're not checking emails, where we're not in this productivity paradigm. So we love, that sounds cynical. There is lots of talking about decolonising how we work, about dismantling systems, about shifting the paradigm, but to actually do that, to actually unschool and learn and be led by spirit, to be led by something that's bigger than ourselves, we have to get off that treadmill. And so I think, for me, when we talk about the sector in general, when we're talking about decolonising conservation, it's also our own ways of working, and we need we need that deep time span. You know, because if we're really going to enter into being with and working with communities, it can't just be this productivist, post-capitalist, you know, time frame. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I get quite impassioned by it, because I really do believe that the philanthropy and funding sector has to match the reality of what community conservation really looks like and means. So final question, because then we're going to have a couple of questions from you guys at some point. But I just wanted to bring it back to something we've all been talking about a lot, which is belonging. We have a project at Global Diversity Foundation called the Patchwork of Belonging, which is an inquiry into the ways we find belonging and connection. And in a couple of hours, we're making a St. Ethelburga's Patchwork of Belonging in the tent. So if you want to come and make a patch, please do. It'll be going for a few hours. But what is belonging? What is belonging to you? What does that question mean? Yeah, where does it sit with you? And whoever feels.
It's also a good audience question, so ponder on it as I talk. So to me, belonging it's interesting. So how I feel it and how it was cultivated, and bringing it to trust here, it's in the moments where you are in relationship or in community with somebody, or you're just, you know, attending. It was one of the moments where I wasn't trying to drive a deliverable or create an outcome. It was when we were just kind of hanging out, you know. It was when we were we cultivated an opportunity to learn about each other, to learn about this tradition, or an opportunity to just visit and be in place and be welcomed, and not having to have a sort of identity, you know. I think that's a hard thing to navigate as a conservationist, or even I worked in municipal government, right, where there were times where, even though I didn't have a badge, but I worked for the city, that created this barrier, right, of connecting, because all of a sudden I was seen as someone that worked for the institution and not as myself. And so really showing up with so much intentionality of just showing up when, you know, when you're invited and when you're feeling welcomed, I think is important. And recognizing, owning your positionality, but also being authentic, like being yourself and all the complexities and identities that you are. Sometimes we're so fixated on compartmentalizing our lives, you know, like I'm gonna put this hat on, I'm gonna put this other hat. But I have felt this belonging when I was able to own all of it. When I was able to own my identity as a woman, when I was able to own my identity as an immigrant, as my identity as a conservationist, as all of these different things all in one. And I think that idea of like things coexisting at the same time fosters such an authenticity that I think cultivates belonging, but also it expresses it and it spreads it to others, you know? And so connecting it to the land, like recognizing who the land is, the place where we are, and the complexities and the different dimensions that it carries, I think that is what helps me at least foster belonging, and being a little unapologetic, right? Because I'm still unlearning. I'm still going to learn more, but if I don't show my full self, then only parts of me will learn, and I think it's all of a collective. How is my full self learning? I think that's how I am practicing that now.
Belonging is a word I think Maritza and I have discussed in detail. We keep going back and forth, trying to figure out what it means. And when I look back into my life, it's something that I struggled to identify, because I always felt out of place, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room, at some point you felt that in your life. You always feel like you're in a space, but you're not really fully being accepted for who you are, for what you stand for. And I always felt that I needed to morph myself to be seemed as fit for that space. And I think with time I've begun to appreciate that belonging for me is where I feel like I can truly show up as my authentic self, where the community that I'm with is a community that shares my values, the same values, not necessarily my values, but the same values, and that there's space for a lot of understanding and curiosity and empathy, and that, you know, there's a lot of space to just question and learn and unlearn and, you know, just weave through things. So that has really shaped and changed over time, and it probably will continue changing as we go along, because that transition continues to unfold in the different spaces that I find myself in. When I was living in the city, when I moved to the Maasai Mara, coming to the UK now, and just identifying and defining what belonging means in all these different spaces is a continuous learning journey.
I guess for me, yeah, as I mentioned at the very beginning, it is actually also a term that has been extremely important in the way in which I've been thinking about how I exist in the world, and how I critically think about my own positionality also as a white person in Morocco, for instance. How do I show up? How I'm there present, but also how can I be in community and in deep relationship with a place, no matter which place it is. And I think what is also interesting in thinking with the term is that it's something that encapsulates both past, present, and future. There is a question of longing, which is somewhat linked to thinking with the past, honoring collective memory, holding to it, reenacting it, reactivating it. But it also is a precondition for thinking what can this place look like for us as a collective in becoming. How can we imagine it together? How can we be together otherwise? So yeah, I guess.
I just had one thing to add that both of you kind of sparked a reminder in my mind, and there's a saying in Mexico which says "ni de aquí ni de allá." So as an immigrant of the U.S., I wasn't American enough, but I also wasn't Mexican. I wasn't American enough to be American, whatever. And I wasn't Mexican enough, right? There's like, it's either or. And that always, like, since a kid, was just like, what is it? But then something quite instrumental happened, and it was a pivot, and it was grounding on a monarch butterfly. So monarch butterflies are these beautiful migratory species, butterflies that migrate from the north to the south. And they're both super fragile because they're endangered, and they're also really resilient. So they're coexisting, and they're doing both of those things at once. And to me, that was a lesson of being like, I can be both. I'm both. It's not either or. I am enough, and I am enough in both sides. And what a beauty to blend both of those things, you know, to be strong in that sense. And so I think just that shift in perspective is really important. And so now, when I think about belonging in this sense, and how I do my practice in conservation work, whatever, I don't consider myself a conservationist. A lot of my peers will, like, I kind of maybe agree to this, but I'm more of a facilitator, because I like to cultivate those kinds of opportunities and support systems, right? Like, how can you be both? How can two things coexist at the same time? And I think is what maybe hopefully drives us more to finding our own sense of belonging.
Thank you so much, Maritza. That was beautiful, and I think it speaks to the complexity and nuance that's needed. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Okay, folks, we've only got a couple of minutes, so is there a burning question?
Hello,
Okay.
It's not a question, really, and I speak out of total ignorance, but just this last week, Marrakesh is in Morocco, right? Well, I became aware through a conversation I had with her that the Berbers are not allowed to talk in their own language, or if you're a tourist guide, you may not refer to your history. You may not point out any of your history. And this is, as strangers to that country, which you may have been, it's just, I was quite shocked, you know, and this is happening to the Ukrainians who are taken by the Russians. They're not allowed to speak in their own language.
So that's not exactly accurate. Well, first of all, I would encourage to not use Berber and try to use Amazigh. Berber is the Francophone and Roman description of Barbaros, and so barbarian. Amazigh would be the most correct definition of the population and the language. The Amazigh communities across North Africa have been heavily repressed. That's true in general. That applies also to Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt. In Morocco, in the early 2000s, with the new king, which is now not anymore new, Mohammed VI. The story is controversial, we can talk about it more, but he did came, so until then, with the previous king, Hassan II, it's true that Amazigh languages were repressed as much as the culture and the identity linked to that. The language was never lost, and it is, since the 2000s, one of the official languages. So it is spoken, it is also written. The story is a bit more complicated. Mohammed VI is not exactly a revolutionary king in many ways, but there was a constitutional reform that reintroduced the Amazigh language as an official language in Morocco from the early 2000s. So it is spoken, yes.
I'm saying that we have now talked for so long with people and somehow assuming that understanding is enough. But I feel that these people whose lives are so difficult and fragile, it's because everything's been taken away from them. Talking is not going to change it. So unless the people who own everything now consider giving back to these people at least a significant amount of what they've taken away, I don't see how anything changes. Do you agree with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different ways to respond to that. I would go down a less practical route and say I think we're in a spiritual vacuum at the moment. I think we're in the realm of the hungry ghosts, where nothing is enough. So if you need to have 100 Ferraris that's not a rational, logical person. So my response is, which I'm not speaking on behalf of the panel, that I think it's a spiritual vacuum that needs to be addressed, because then when you constantly acquiring, in my culture, well, my tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist culture, we have something called the hungry ghost, which is this long-necked creature that can just never be satiated. So for me, that's the work that needs to happen, which is a really abstract answer to your abstract question. But I don't know what other people think.
I think, to me, I'll say it's a practice, and I think the conversation is one way to engage. And over time, my hope is that enough practice, enough examples, or leading by example, is shifting perspectives. And I think I can't speak for the work that I've done, but I've been welcomed to rooms now where there's big decision makers in these platforms, in these rooms that I'm helping facilitate. And while maybe it didn't impact them in any way, maybe a story, but something stuck. And I'm hopeful that we're planting seeds throughout. And while we don't have to be a farmer that's cultivating the seeds over time and sowing and tending to that seed, we could be birds, and we can just continue spreading seeds until something grows. And I don't know, maybe this is just my, again, not as practical, but I think many of you will now have these conversations, like there is action in there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think we ultimately need people in positions of power and great wealth being disruptive. Like that, I do think that's incredibly important. We're being given the sign of it feels very symbolic, the Time's Up sign, which I want to ignore desperately, but I'm going to get into trouble. So we're going to be here for we're going to be around, we're not going to get in the way. We're going to be here if you want to come and talk. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to our wonderful speakers. So yeah, thank you.